Okay, great. Good morning. Oh, I see so many nice friends and um, familiar faces here. Dear Lucio, dear Cristiano, dear Werner Robeck, dear board of the university and the ILEK, and all the people came together here today, friends of Frei Otto and the research. So I have to say, thanks for bringing us together to this special occasion to honor, to remember, to rethink, to rediscover, and also to criticize Frei Otto in a nice way. This is research, I think, so we have to constantly criticize each other. As Cristiano just said, it's a personal joy to reconnect with all of you and to revive a bit all the memories and the discussions we developed over the last years, sometimes decades. Indeed, in 2017, we had the privilege of creating a major exhibition on Vrachliotis in Karlsruhe, followed by iterations at the Venice Biennale 2018 about the Multihalle in Jeddah, Saudi, and at the Yale School of Architecture in New Haven. Each time we pieced together a different portrait of Frei Otto's world, of his universe in a way, through his models, essays, drawings, and ideas. Just as powerful were the conversations, the shared memories, the stories that emerged between the collaborators, the teams, the students, and the peers. Frei Otto's thinking was never locked in a file, a document, or frozen in a model, or even in an archival object. Otto was a communication hub, like it or not, who was in contact with so many people, inspiring even more. For those of us who have studied, critiqued, or extended his work over the years, it's not about building a monument for him again, but keeping that critical openness he established alive. And yes, it's important to acknowledge that Otto was not the first to experiment with hanging roofs, nor did the concept of adaptable building, designing membranes, or textile architecture begin with him. And yet this does not diminish his significance. His legacy lies not in being first, or being singular, but in how his work catalyzed new ways of thinking and how it creates spaces for an open debate, a critical debate, an open research question, and allowed others to imagine differently. So the question for us is, I guess, what does it mean to build in an age where the climate is no longer stable, where the boundaries between the natural and the built are dissolving, and where the language of ecology has become both an imperative and inflationary? So let me begin to manage my script. No. Let me begin with where we are here, the wonderful place where we all are gathered right now, test building for the tent structure design for the Expo 67 in Montreal, together with Wolf Woodward. And while the tent can be recognized in the background of the image, something entirely different emerged in the foreground, something that might initially seem pretty trivial, even unremarkable. You see an apparatus, a so-called artificial sun, a machine for simulating sunlight and the shadows cast by buildings on physical models. This image gives us an impression of how heavy and how expensive it was from today's digital perspective to build physical models, to analyze them, and then measure them. And again, we can experience how analog and time-consuming his research with physical models really was. Although it seems just a snapshot taken during the everyday lab culture here in the Institute, I have to admit that is one of my favorite images. Not only shows how inventive Frei Otto and his team were and how experimental his approach could be, but also that environmental thinking was part of his scientific imagination from the very beginning. An imagination that did not separate science from design or technology from care. The machine asks us about the power of the sun and the beauty of natural light, the precision of shadows, and how to operationalize natural media by technology. It turned light into a medium of spatial intelligence. Otto understood that shadow is not a byproduct, but a design material. He performed detailed sun and shade studies for projects in the desert climate, including tents and umbrellas that respond to shifting solar angles, not just functionally, but pretty poetically. His architecture played with the ephemeral, how light moved across canvas, how heat could be mitigated through form, and how shade could become a civic resource. The sun machine stands alongside all the many other devices we know and love, the soap bubble machines, the measuring tables, the sand pattern devices, and so on. It shows how deeply Otto was committed to something I would call device design. Each device was a testament to the care, to the, let's say, natural complexity, and the effort that went into translating environmental thinking into architectural form. The model in the sun machine is this one. It shows an intermediate stage of what is perhaps the most unfinished and therefore most provocative process in Otto's work, the so-called eco-house project. At first glance, it doesn't quite align with the elegant visual language and the smooth form-finding narrative typically associated with Frei Otto's lightweight structures. More a big bricolage of ideas than a single coherent product. It is an attempt to interpret ecology as a question of living. Today, I thought, let's speak not about the figure of Frei Otto as we often recall him, the engineer, the lightness pioneer, the membrane builder, but about Otto as, let's call him, an ecological thinker, as someone who practiced architecture as a form of experimental resistance. Living Spaces and a Garden, preparatory study for the Eco House building project in Berlin. That's the full title of a curious little booklet, first shown to the public in May 1985, 40 years ago, at a press conference for the International Building Exhibition IBA in West Berlin. Nearly 150 pages long, printed in a very, very small run. It wasn't even meant for the public. It was just a working document, put together fast, almost improvised, to help clarify what building ecologically could actually mean in the 80s. Its experimental and almost rough production aesthetic underscored the sense of urgency with which Frei Otto sought to tackle ecological challenges in architecture back then. It radiated the atmosphere of a working document, raw, iterative, and materially open. But the study was more than a purely academic project. It was a direct response to the doubts expressed repeatedly during the planning process for the eco-houses designed by Otto and Hermann Kendall for Berlin. Although Josef Paul Kleihaus, then director of the division of the new building, the IBA, had explicitly commissioned Frei Otto and his team with the conception and the planning of an ecological residential building according to the principles of nature and building, he suddenly had doubts about the ecological core of the project. This booklet carries the urgency of a lab notebook, not the polish of a publication. The booklet was a manifesto and a provocation, an attempt to foreground ecology as both a spatial and political program in the Eber's postmodern context. And basically, the core of the booklet is based on, let's say, three strategies of how Otto tried to convince the Eber board that there is a core of ecology in this housing project. The first strategy was this collage you just saw. The second one was a huge and very fine-tuned timeline about his idea of nature, building and nature, including many, many of his own ideas. So it was not 100% scientific, objective, historical timeline. It was a very subjective piece of design. He designed the timeline basically for himself. And the third strategy was always looping back to his own track record as an architect or as an engineer. That means bringing in as key references his own, let's say, student projects on housing. And one of the key images or let's say drawings for the last strategy is this one here, which basically shows one of the earliest housing projects Otto developed as a student in 1951. And there's a great quote Frei Otto used to comment on this beautiful drawing he did as a student. So Otto said, "Every apartment is sold together with the accompanying part of the lot. There is therefore not just one owner of the whole building. Every partial owner has a total unlimited right to ceilings or the middle of the central wall. With his architect, the owner, he builds his home as he sees fit. He has complete freedom to do so. The less the building department worries about artistic matters, it must, after all, negotiate with every individual owner and perhaps with a number of architects, the more interesting the building will become. ILEK builds the one department, a Wright, Frank Lloyd Wright, or a Bonatz, the other one. Every different people live in different apartments. You can see it from the outside of the building, and you know immediately who lives there, what end." So this was Frei Otto in 1951, just 26-year-old, finishing his study in Berlin and already thinking beyond the frame. At first glance, the stacked single-family home, that's the title, sounds like a dry typological experiment. But what Otto outlines here is not just a housing model. It's a social collective vision of ownership. You can disagree on it, but Otto sketches one of the earliest blueprints for participatory architecture in post-war Europe, I think. Inspired by the many discussions on living in the 50s, Frei Otto began to work more intensively on alternative housing concepts. In another manuscript 8 years later, in 1959, which is more an open and incomplete collection of materials than a finished book, Otto combined under the concept of adaptable architecture his own notes and sketches with selected contributions, projects, and reprinted fragments of text by other architects. This is not only produced as a unique source book on the subject of adaptable architecture in the post-war area, but also an experimental comment, let's say, a political comment on the situation of the housing question at that time. The spectrum of assembled contributions range from lesser-known works such as Flexibility, the Planning and Design of Structures by the American architect Anthony Harray, to more popular projects such as Martin Wagner's The Growing House or Jonas Friedman's L'Architecture Mobile, or even Rolf Donner's Dynamic Housing Shell. as well as all kinds of references to industrial architecture by David George Emmerich and Konrad Wachsmann. Frei Otto appeared here in multiple roles, as always, sometimes as an intellectual architect and author, sometimes as editor and a curator of ideas of other people. One central chapter of the manuscript stands out: apartment buildings for New York. In it, Frei Otto sketches a vision for 3 green residential towers located in the Central Park. Where else? Unlike his earlier shelf system projects, these towers were attached to a central spine, giving each residential floor the freedom to be designed independently. The building is oriented in all directions, he wrote. There will be sunny, shady, and wind-protected places. There will be places where no one can look in, even in this densely settled city of New York. And here again, Otto anticipated a mode of architecture that was ecological, we can disagree. It was flexible, we can disagree. And it was social, we can disagree. Was there were towers in the Central Park. But it was an interplay of light and shade, and privacy, openness, public and private. So, let me conclude with few thoughts. First, the Eco House project were Frei Otto's long-standing and ultimately unfinished attempt to bring it all together. A big synthesis, not just of materials or techniques, but of decades of experiments, models, and insight about society folded into one big single project. It was not about comfort, not about efficiency. It was about integration, about rethinking what a building could be when it holds many systems, technical, social, ecological, all together. The Eco House were less a product and more a provocation, a spatial code for charging design with political urgency and then just build it. Second, the question of living and how we inhabit the environment in our world was always there in Otto's work, quietly. From his students' project to his vision for New York City, from tents to platforms. But with the Eco House, it became a lens for imagining not just new buildings, but a new kind of society, different people, different desires. And in the end, the Eco House weren't the answer. They were a big question, built large. Was it idealistic? Perhaps. Was it too open? At times, yes. But what Frei Otto offered was not a closed model. It was an open vocabulary, a grammar of ecological engagement in architecture that continues to challenge us today. Thank you.